Hello, Petal. Thanks for coming back and joining me for chapter 13 of You Don't Have to Be Evil to Work Here, But It Helps. J.W. Wells & Co. Book 4 by Tom Holt. Yeah, poor Colin's getting thwarted at every turn, isn't he? If you need a catch-up of the last chapter, I've got them all in a playlist, on a podcast, all in order. So go on back and have a little listen, it's all free. So, anyway, once you've listened to that one, welcome back to this one. But thank you all so much for listening. I really do appreciate you. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to whiffle on and say, if you'd like to hit the notifications bell and give us a follow, maybe give us a share if you want to, leave a comment if you like it. Anyway, please excuse the slight delay. I've had a bit of a sniffle, so that's affected my voice. I will do the best I can. So if I'm slightly off par, I do apologise, but I really do want to keep bringing the chapters to you. So soldiering on. Let's get down to it. Right. Chapter 13. Banks have a thing about snappy, friendly-sounding slogans. They want to be thought of as action banks, listening banks, banks that like to say yes. The Bank of the Dead was no exception. Originally founded in China over 1,000 years ago as a means whereby the living could provide for the souls of their ancestors in the afterlife, the bank had pioneered the concept of the snappy, friendly slogan along with paper money and the endowment mortgage. Though some of their earlier efforts at catchy advertising punchlines had, on reflection, struck them as unfortunate, now you can take it with you, regrettably followed up with, why not pockets and shrouds? They'd always been rather proud of one they'd come up with towards the close of the Yuan dynasty, the Bank of the Dead. We are your future. Small wonder then that dealing with them on a daily basis for nearly 3 years had come to prey on Benny's mind. The one thing that came close to setting it at rest was the door that separated his office from their bleak, dimensionless realm. It was only cheap plywood, but it was hexed, bewitched, shielded and enchanted with every kind of spell, incantation, charm and rune known to the trade, along with a battery of locks whose wards existed on different spatio-temporal planes, and a chain forged from meteorite iron in the flames of the last of the great dragons. It's an uncertain world, and Benny had never trusted it or any of its components. But if there was one thing in which he had any degree of faith, it was the door, which someone had apparently opened. He stood and stared at it for close to 20 seconds. Understandable. It's not every day that you see something that's completely impossible. The door couldn't be open, because he knew for a stone-cold fact that he'd locked it himself, personally. It wasn't something he was slapdash about, and he had the one and only set of keys. Just to make sure that he hadn't left them in his desk drawer, he felt his right thigh until he found the chain, looped around his manticore high trouser belt, from which his key ring hung in his pocket. He pulled them out and looked at them. All present and correct. So, Benny thought, if I didn't unlock it, and I've got the only keys, and it's magically impossible for anybody on this side to open the door without the keys, stands to reason. He shuddered. The disturbing fact was that the defences, though theoretically perfect and absolute, only really worked from this side. It wasn't supposed to be that way. That was the whole point of the door. But Benny was a realist. Everything real, even magic, obeys certain basic physical laws. But the dead aren't real. It's one of their salient features, and accordingly they are bound by no laws or rules of any kind. Door or no door, deep down in his uncomfortable soul, Benny knew that the dead only stayed on their side because of a gentleman's agreement between Mr. Dow, the bank's chief cashier, and Jack Wells, the firm's erstwhile senior partner. Under the terms of the deal, J.W. Wells & Co. had moved all their accounts to the bank, in return for higher interest rates on fixed-term deposits, highly competitive business account charges, free monthly statements, and a promise, on Mr. Dow's word of honour, not to come through the door and start abducting the living. Any breach of the agreement, it was strictly understood, wouldn't be tolerated, which meant that if the dead did come marauding through the door, snatching up any hapless mortal who crossed their path and dragged them back with them into their infinity of desolation and despair, JWW would be entitled to close all their accounts and take their business elsewhere without incurring penalty charges or loss of interest. That was, of course, a comfort. But Benny backed away slowly until he was standing by his desk. Without turning his head or taking his gaze from the door, he leaned back and fumbled till he'd laid hands on a 10-foot pole he kept handy for all sorts of reasons. With this he prodded at the door until it swung shut. Then he pounced forward and started shooting home bolts and turning keys. That was better, but only up to a point. He'd locked the stable door, but something told him he was way, way beyond stray horses. Something had come through. Whatever it was, there was a fair chance that it was still in the building, and since he was the firm's pest control officer, which was only a PC way of saying hero, it was his job to go and look for it. How jolly nice! The problem was, how do you set about looking for the dead? The undead? Now that was a piece of cake. Benny had a whole battery of handy pocket-sized gadgets, ranging from the basic cheap and cheerful pedestrian zombie find and stake to the cutting-edge top-of-the-line RDG-200 from Val Helsing Direct. If that looked good, they'd do him. He didn't know what to look for, because he knew perfectly well what he was looking for didn't exist. It'd be like poking butter with a hot needle. "Never mind," said a quiet voice inside Benny's head. "If it was easy, they wouldn't need you to do it." "Fine," Benny sighed. The most obvious way to find lurking predators from beyond the veil was to wander about the building looking weak and helpless. He was under no illusions about their possible intentions. They weren't here to see the sights or do a spot of early Christmas shopping. If they'd broken through, it was only because of their insatiable, ravening hunger for some tiny scrap of life, and it had driven them to it. The best way to find them would be to offer them bait and lure them into attacking. How he'd deal with them once he'd found them was another problem he didn't have an answer to right now, but with any luck, he'd think of something when the time came. No point sneaking and prancing around the place, Starsky and Hutch style, flattening himself against walls and kicking doors open. Instead, he stuck his hands in his pockets, let his shoulders slump, and strolled down the corridor in the general direction of the stationery cupboard. Just around the corner, he met the thin-faced girl from Entertainment and Media, the one whose name he could never remember. Even at JWW, questions like, "Excuse me, but have you seen any dead people recently?" would likely result in lips being pursed and eyebrows raised. Instead, he asked, "Did you see anybody come out of my office just now?" She frowned before answering, "You mean the young couple in the funny clothes?" Just occasionally, it's better to search hopelessly than to find. "That'd be them," Benny replied. "You don't happen to remember which way they went?" More serious consideration. Then she said, "I think they were heading for the back stairs. You only just missed them." "Thanks," Benny muttered, and started to walk away. But the thin-faced girl coughed meaningfully. "Have you got a minute?" she asked. "What? No, actually," Benny said. "I wanted a quick word with those people before they leave the building." "Only?" the thin-faced girl went on, as though she hadn't heard him. "I wanted to ask about something. Not you personally," she added, and the tip of her usually sallow nose pinkened a little. "A senior practitioner, someone with wisdom, knowledge and experience." In spite of what the proverbs say, the difference between flattery and Virgin Atlantic is that, occasionally, flattery will get you somewhere. "Fair enough," Benny said. "What?" "Love filter," the thin-faced girl said. "I've a job on at the moment where the use of love filter seems the obvious course." Benny grinned. "You haven't been here long, have you?" The thin-faced girl narrowed her eyes, making herself look remarkably like a chisel. Define long. Because if you had, Benny went on smoothly, you'd know that the firm's fortunes were founded on the stuff. JWW's patent oxyhydrogen love filter. Never touched the stuff myself, he added. Never needed to, but it works, no doubt about it. Yes, the thin-faced girl said. Quite. I, however, have never used it before. Kindly state the recommended dose and the effects. Right. Benny thought for a moment. 5 millilitres ought to get the job done. It tastes funny, so if you're administering it by stealth, best mix it with something. Alcohol is fine, but anything with sugar in it can lead to side effects. What happens when you drink it is, you're fine for between 2 and 15 minutes, depending on metabolism, and then you pass out. Zappo. When you come round, the first person you see is it. Back in the old days, we used to put something in it to make it opposite sex specific. But now we're a bit more broad-minded and flexible. Once it's done the job, that's it, till death do us part, basically. I remember once back in 76. Thank you, the thin-faced girl said. You've been extremely helpful. No worries, Benny replied. The intended victims. Anybody I know? She didn't answer that. Instead, she opened her bag and took out a small jar. Manticore fat, she said. Applied liberally to the skin, it will render you invulnerable to dragonfire and the acidic spittle of harpies. A token of appreciation, she added. Goodbye. Benny stood for several seconds after she'd clip-clopped away down the corridor, looking at the jar balanced on the palm of his hand. He knew all about manticore fat, of course. In particular, he knew that it didn't actually work as a dragon slayer's barrier cream, although it was the best thing on the market for bicycle sprockets. What puzzled him was that it was there at all. People don't usually give him presents for just answering simple work-related questions. He was both touched and suspicious, in roughly equal proportions. Who the hell was she, anyway? Then he remembered what he'd been doing, cursed himself for allowing himself to be distracted, stuffed the pot into his jacket pocket, and broke into a run. There was an unfamiliar knock at Cassie's door. She looked up from the lease that she was studying, and frowned. Couldn't be Connie, or Benny Shumway. They knocked, but distinctively. Dennis Tanner and old Mr. Wells didn't knock, presumably on the basis it was their door and they could open it how and when they damn well pleased. Julie and Christine, the secretaries, had killer woodpecker knocks, while Peter Melsnick and Kaz Suslovich both tended to stand outside the door and say, "Hello," plaintively, like dogs left outside in the rain. Cassie pulled herself together. Why speculate when she could know? "Come in," she said, and the door opened. They stood in the doorway, hand in hand. An objective observer might have said they were sweet, their fingers tenderly entwined, her cheek resting on his shoulder. Ask any doctor, however, and he'll be sure to tell you sweet things are bad for you. "Miss Clay," the young man said. Cassie opened her mouth, but some joker had hit the mute button. What she'd been meaning to say was, "I know you. You're in that tea shop, the Funkhausen's Loop." She didn't get round to doing that, however. Mostly it was because she could see the corridor outside and the door opposite, even though they were standing in the way. The weird was commonplace at 70 St Mary Axe. Even there, however, it was reasonable to assume that translucent people were bad news. "Are we disturbing you?" asked the girl. Trick question, surely. In which case, give the reply they aren't expecting. "No," Cassie croaked. What can I do for you?" The man and the girl looked at each other. There was a sort of transcendent suppiness in their eyes that would have brought yesterday's dinner to the lips of Barbara Cartland. Then the girl said, "We'd like to come back to life, please, if that's all right." Cassie felt as though someone had parked a large skip right on top of her chest. She said again, "Are you dead?" They nodded. They were, she noticed, wearing matching sweaters with little sheep on them. "Right. Instinct, years of meeting clients and taking notes, had her reaching for pen and paper. "Well," she went on, "properly speaking, that'd be necromancy, and that's not really my department. Probably you need to go and see my colleague, Mr. Wells, or Mr. Melsnick might be able to." The girl looked at her companion, worried and disappointed. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Somehow, Cassie just knew that his pet name for the girl was Pumpkin. "Actually," he said, "we were rather hoping you could help us. You see—" "You're me," the girl said. It wasn't interrupting, more like a sort of staggered chorus. Cassie had always hated it when boyfriends had finished her sentences for her. Next thing, she always thought, they'd be stealing her soul. "What did you say?" Cassie asked. "You're me," the girl repeated. "Or at least, I'm you. I can never remember which way round it ought to be, though I don't suppose it really matters terribly much. It'd probably be easier to say, we're us." Like hell, Cassie's instincts were shrieking. I could be many things, but never such a pathetic bloody drip. "How do you mean exactly?" she said. The man broke in. "We don't mean to be pushy," he said, "but do you think we could possibly come in and sit down, rather than having this discussion where anybody could hear us?" "Fine." Cassie waved vaguely at the visitors' chairs. Before he sat down, the man made a point of closing the door. "All right," Cassie said, and in her own voice she heard the getting down to business tone she'd perfected over the years for talking to punters. She was impressed by her own professionalism. Pen poised over paper, she said, "Can we start off with your names?" Once again they exchanged glances. "Well, no," the girl said. "You see, we lost them." "You lost your names?" The man nodded. "When we died? Yes, it happens sometimes. It's a kind of—" He hesitated, and then the girl squeezed his hand again, and Cassie could see him drawing strength from her like a tanker refuelling, and it was oh so romantic and sad that she wanted to scream. "It's a kind of punishment," he went on, "for, unaliving ourselves voluntarily." Cassie heard the pen clatter onto her desk, which suggested that she'd dropped it. "Unaliving yourselves?" They both nodded simultaneously. "You see," the girl went on, "when we found out that we couldn't be together—" "Right." Cassie groped for a pencil in her desk tidy. "I see. No names. I suppose addresses are out of the question too, in that case." The girl gave her a small, apologetic smile. "Not to worry," Cassie said firmly. "I'll just put down X and, Y, and you're both dead." "That's right," the man said. "I see. And you want us to, do something about that for you?" "Yes, please." Cassie took a deep breath, and in the back of her mind she was frantically skimming through dusty old memory folders of day release lectures and vocational training weekends, from back when she'd been keen and eager. "Well," she said, "if you were wanting to lodge a formal appeal, there's a fairly straightforward procedure. First, you have to serve notice of intention to appeal within 6 months of date of death." She fixed her stare on a small patch of wall about 3 inches above the man's head. "When would that have been, precisely?" "That's complicated," the man replied. "Is it?" He nodded. "Depends which one you mean," he replied. "I see. So, which of you died first?" "Not like that." The girl was twiddling the ends of her hair round her left index finger, presumably out of nerves. "You see—" "Yes, the thing is," the man said, "it sort of happened more than once." "More than once?" This time Cassie stared straight at him. "What? You mean death?" "Yes, that's right," the girl said. "Because of reincarnation, you see." The soft ping that Cassie heard just then was her pencil lead snapping. "Reincarnation?" "Yes." The man nodded enthusiastically. "It's because we're star-crossed, you see," he said. what happened was we were supposed to get together and get married and live happily ever after, but something must have gone wrong, and we didn't. Cassie saw the girl's fingers tighten around his once more and looked away. So, well, we unalived ourselves. The way you do, Cassie thought. And when we got to the other place, the girl said, we asked to see the manager, and he looked up his files and said, yes, there's been a bit of a mix-up, but not to worry. We could come back to life and meet each other all over again, and everything would be just fine. She hesitated and snuffled loudly. The man fished in his translucent pocket and handed her a see-through tissue. She blew her nose, then went on. So, back we came, and yes, we met up like we'd been told I would, but then Cassie waited while the girl did more snuffling, and the man patted her tenderly on the shoulder. Hell must be like this, Cassie thought. When we got there, the girl continued, we found out. She subsided into snuffledom. The man said, basically, Miss Clay, we found out we didn't love each other anymore. The girl looked up sharply. No, that's not right, Pumpkin. Ah, Cassie thought. We loved each other to bits and pieces, but somehow we couldn't. There didn't seem to be any reason to it, the man said. I mean, she knew she loved me, and I knew I worshipped the ground she stood on, but somehow we couldn't seem to make a go of it. We started quarrelling, which we'd never ever done before. We couldn't talk to each other, the girl whimpered damply. It was terrible. We'd always been able to talk to each other. We used to talk for hours and hours and hours and hours, the man said, tenderly. And then suddenly we couldn't, the girl said. And it was like there was some dreadful force making me blame him when I knew perfectly well it wasn't his fault. Same with me, the man put in. And then one day we had this awful row. And even though we knew we still loved each other 190%, that was it. The end. It was all over. I say, Cassie said, frowning. Excuse me if this sounds silly, but were you in a tea shop at the time? That's right, yes, the girl said, as though Cassie knowing that was the most natural thing ever. Anyway, I ran out into the street, and he didn't follow me. And that was that. Of course, without him life just wasn't worth living. Complete waste of time, the man agreed fervently. And so the next thing we knew, we were back at the other place, the girl said, shredding tissue with her fingers. The manager was there, waiting for us to arrive. I'll say that for him, the man put in. No attempt to pretend it wasn't their fault or anything. We've got no complaints on that score. In fact, we can't speak too highly of the quality of service. And he said, the girl continued, that he couldn't understand what had happened, but naturally he'd send us straight back again for another try. He said that, Cassie mumbled. Oh, yes, the man nodded. Nice bloke. We really took to him. So back we went, only this time, for some reason, we ended up something like 100 years earlier, in Victorian times, which was a bit of a facer, obviously, but we wouldn't have minded. But exactly the same thing happened all over again. Rows, not talking, all that. So you committed unaliving, Cassie said. Voluntarily. Again, more or less, the man said. Well, this time I was a subaltern in the British Army, so I got myself posted to the east and died of malaria. But it was practically unaliving oneself. I fell into a decline, the girl said. You know, like in the romance books. I didn't know it was actually possible. But it is. I say, Cassie said, and she noticed how deep the bite marks were in the pencil she was still holding. Let me guess. You went back again. And again, the girl said with a little sigh. And again. Always the same, of course. We used to say we should be clocking up frequent dire points, the man said. It was our little joke. Something else went bing at that point, but this time it wasn't the pencil lead. It was something deep and fundamental inside Cassie's brain. All right, I get the picture, she interrupted brusquely. But where the hell do I fit into all of this? We're coming to that, the man said severely. You see, the most recent time, when we got there and the manager came out to see us... He was really apologetic, the girl said. I think he was genuinely upset about it all. He told us, the man said, that there's some regulation or other about the number of times you can be reincarnated before you, sort of come to an end. And apparently we'd had our ration. No fault of our own. He made that perfectly clear. But he'd been to see his boss and really made a fuss about it, and as a gesture of goodwill, they were prepared to give us one last chance. He looked at Cassie, and through his pale blue eyes she could see the coat hook on the back of the door. You, he said. Me. The girl's head bobbed up and down. And a man called Colin Hollinghead. You and him, you're our last chance. You're us, you see, reincarnated. If you and he don't get together this time and fall in love and get married, live happily ever after, well, that's all our chances. You stop and She dissolved into sobs, like ice cream in a microwave. The man was patting and hand-squeezing and there-thering, and Cassie had to shout quite loud to make herself heard. Just a fucking minute, she said. They looked up, startled, and stared at her. Sorry, Cassie said. I didn't mean to. Look, she wailed, I really don't want to seem unsympathetic, and it's obvious that you've both had a really raw deal and everything, but I've met this Colin Hollinghead, and he's a nice enough bloke in his way, but... The power of speech ebbed away from her, as though her battery had finally gone flat, and all she could do was wave her hands gently and vaguely. I'm sorry, she repeated, but there it is. The man was staring at her. It was as though a monk or a hermit had spent his entire life praying to be granted a beatific vision, and finally, eventually, one evening in the solitude of his lonely cell, the vision had appeared before him in glory and blown a raspberry. Are you saying, he said slowly, that you're refusing to help us? Cassie gritted her teeth. It was like drowning kittens and decapitating Barbie dolls and whisking up fluffy hamsters in a blender, but it had to be done. That's right, she said. Sorry, she added. But you can't, the girl managed to blurt out before the sobs overtook her again. The man shot Cassie a furious, now look what you've done, glare, and put his arms around the girl, muttering, It's all right, sweetheartness, don't cry. She doesn't really mean it. Yes, I do, Cassie said crisply. Listen to me, she added, raising her voice above the snuffling and the comforting. I really am terribly sorry, but you've got to understand there's nothing I can do. I can't just make up my mind to be in love with someone. It don't work like that. You know that as well as I do. Either you're in love with someone or you aren't. And I'm sorry to say, I've met this Colin Hollinghead, and I have to tell you, I don't love him one bit, and I'm pretty damn sure he doesn't love me. End of story, I'm afraid. The couple didn't say anything. She snuffled, and he glared, but not a word was spoken. It was one of those silences into which light falls and is destroyed, and no matter what the cost, you know you've got to fill it with something before it consumes the entire universe. Look, Cassie said desperately, if there was any way on earth I could deliberately make myself fall in love with the bloody man, I'd do it, just so she'd stop making that horrible noise. But it was like treading on a mine, because even as she said the words, Cassie realised that, yes, there was something she could do. Not just something, but something easy peasy. Something J.W. Wells & Co. had been making possible for over 200 years. When it was first invented, round about the time they were laying the foundations of the Brighton Pavilion, they called it J.W. Wells & Co.'s Patent Oxyhydrogen Love at First Sight filter, and that was all right, because there weren't any trade description laws in those days. And nobody bothered too much about the ropey science, because nobody really knew what oxygen or hydrogen actually were. 2 centuries later, the label just said JWW Love Filter. It was still the same recipe, and it worked just as well as it had always done. And there was always at least one 55-gallon plastic drum of the stuff on hand in the closed file store. All you had to do was drink it, and make him or her drink it too at the same time. Then you both fall asleep for 20 minutes or so, and when you both woke up, assuming that each of you was the first person the other one saw, bingo! Easy as falling off a log into a bottomless pit. These days, there was even orange, mango and tropical fruit flavours. Couldn't be more straightforward. Now, Cassie said, to herself as much as to the 2 translucent lovers, I'm sorry, but I can't help you. Have you ever considered the possibility that you 2 just weren't meant to get together, like Romeo and Juliet or Clark and Lois? She fell silent. Just looking at them, she knew she was drivelling. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a side effect of their revolting translucence. But where their hands clasped, it was as though they'd merged together, like a welded seam. Oh, no, the girl said firmly. You see, the manager told us in the other place. He looked it up in the register and everything. We were supposed to live happily ever after, 70 years and never a cross word. They exchanged a look so gooey that Cassie instinctively wiped her hands on her knees. So we know for a definite fact it was meant to be. Also, she went on, Mr. Dow, that's the manager's name, he said that if things didn't work out and we never did get married and so on, it'd cause a big problem. Hyperphasic anomaly in the spatio-temporal interface, I think he called it. Anyway, it sounded pretty bad. All sorts of things would start coming unravelled, he reckoned. For a start, you see, we were going to have 6 children. 3 of each, the man put in dreamily. And they were all going to go on and do wonderful things with their lives and make the world a better place. And if we don't, well, that's a future gone wrong for a start. Like, suppose one of our kids was going to be a great doctor who cured a dreadful disease and saved millions of lives. But instead, the man carried on, smooth as a well-trained relay team. He's never born, so all those people who should have lived actually die. Mr. Dow was really upset about that. He said it'd cause havoc with schedules and staff duty rosters and accommodation arrangements and sittings for meals and things like that. So you see, he went on, it's not just us who's affected. It's millions and millions of other people too. Shit, Cassie thought. Millions and millions of people. She really ought to care about that. And besides, what in the world could possibly be more important than true love? It's the message that everybody's bombarded with, from primary school to crematorium. Love is all you need, they tell you. It's so fundamental that it's practically a duty, like recycling or voting in elections. If she drank the filter and spiked Colin's tea with the stuff, there was absolutely no question. They'd be in love. Forever. They'd be just as blissfully, repulsively happy as the 2 specimens nestling up close in front of her. That had to be a good thing, surely. It was accepted throughout the trade. Love filter was a good thing because it made people happy. No bitter traumatic breakups, broken hearts, ruined lives with love filter. No ghastly mistaken choices. It was like an arranged marriage made in heaven. Stone cold guaranteed or your money back. So really, there was no earthly reason, except that she didn't love young Mr. Hollinghead. Not one little bit. Cassie took a deep breath. Sorry, she said. Up and down the back stairs, along the corridors in every direction, in and out of the conference rooms and the stationery cupboards and the laser printer bay and everywhere, not a trace of them anywhere. It was as though they'd just walked straight out through a wall or something, which, Benny reminded himself, they were probably quite capable of doing. He could feel himself running out of steam as the hopelessness of his task gradually became apparent. Unless he was lucky enough to run into them by sheer accident, he was wasting his time. He traipsed back to his office, sat down on a stack of green timesheet pads, just arrived from the printers, still in their shrink wrap. He spared a moment from his despair to hate the new management, and let his head loll forwards onto his chest. He'd done his best, but he'd failed. The question was, what now? The obvious, logical, sensible thing would be to keep quiet, pretend it had never happened, and get on with the work he was supposed to be doing. The alternative was going and finding one of the bosses and telling him what had happened, so that he could immediately notify the firm's insurers. If he did that, he might get yelled out for a bit, but nothing terribly bad would happen. After all, he was the cashier, the one who had to make the soul-corroding, brain-melting trip to the Bank of the Dead every day. They couldn't fire him because the job had to be done, and who else would be crazy enough to do it? If he went and confessed, like he was supposed to, it'd stop being his responsibility. He could pass it on to someone else, and they'd be the one facing sleepless nights and nightmare days haunted with stark terror. Benny sat up. That'd be a very bad reason for doing the right thing. Benny Shumway had his faults, as his ex-wives knew to their cost, but he wasn't a coward, and he faced up to his responsibilities, one of which was the door in his office. If someone, something, had broken through it and was infesting the land of the living, it was his job to deal with it. The other name for pest control was heroism. In the same way, admittedly, as estate agents describe Swindon as the edge of the Cotswolds. It's not, but never mind. Besides, if he went to one of the ex-partners, or even worse, the new management, who did he think they'd assigned to the case? The pest control specialist. Fine. He stood up, climbed onto his chair, fetched a book down from the top shelf of his bookcase and blew dust off it. Necromancy for Dummies. How long since he'd read it? No matter. He turned to the index. Dead. Unquiet. Exercising. A good place to start as any. There's one thing every practitioner should know about exercising. Can't be done. There's a whole heap of books, see further reading, pages 427 to 558. That'll tell you how to go about it, but guess what? They're all making it up. You can't banish the dead, and for why? Because they don't exist. Benny sighed and put the book down on his desk. He remembered now. Oh, he thought. Next, he tried the Office Procedures Manual, twice as thick and half again as heavy as Necromancy for Dummies, and it said more or less the same thing, but without the comic patter. There's no point in trying to impose your will on something that isn't there, like the non-existent man on the stair in the nursery rhyme. Dead and gone means what it says. Deal with it. Yes, Benny thought, but logic. Access your inner spook. The books, who ought to know, said that the dead weren't there anymore. On the other hand, something had opened the door, and it hadn't been from his side. Furthermore, he had the evidence of the thin-faced girl, what's her name, who'd seen them in the corridor. So, either the books were wrong, impossible, or he was wrong, also impossible, or else, entirely impossible, he was missing the point. He growled under his breath. Something had opened the door, but obviously it couldn't have been dead, but it had come from the other side, and nothing could possibly live out there, by definition, unless... Benny jumped up. His feet were running before they hit the carpet, like the cat in the cartoons. Well, that's a conundrum and a half. I mean, come on, Cassie, take one for the team. You know, when you got Love Filter, I suppose, well, it's kind of like self-sacrifice. Colin's willing to do it. He was willing to do it in the previous chapter, but they wouldn't let him. It's a thinker. It's definitely a thinker. Please excuse a creative license off and on throughout that in places, but, you know, books written in a certain time and reading them out in present day is two completely different things. So don't come for me. Don't come for me. I digress. Thank you so much for listening all the way through. If you've got this far, I would appreciate it if people listen through to the end, because then it doesn't mess with my analytics. I'm not being weird and kind of going, oh, my whole world revolves around my analytics. Oh. But, you know, it really does help to keep the channel going. You know, same as those likes and those shares and those comments and the feedback and the notifications bell. And I know I go on about these things, but it really does help. It means I can keep doing these books for you. Makes it all worthwhile, you know. Okay, so stay safe because the weather's going to get a bit feisty here in the UK tomorrow, apparently. Like, oh my God, there's going to be 16 inches of snow. Translated. 2. Maybe on the high ground it's going to be that much snow, so, you know, watch out for everybody that's up there and hope everybody's okay. Anyway, take it easy, look after yourselves, and I'll see you next time, Petal.